Deep in the Alaskan wilderness, where nature rules with both beauty and brutality, a baby grizzly was fighting for its life. Coiled tightly in the crushing grip of a giant anaconda, a predator that shouldn't even exist in these frozen lands, the cub's tiny heart beat slower with each passing second. No one was supposed to be there. But then, a group of men heard a scream that didn't sound human, but was just as desperate. What they saw, they'll never forget. But what the mother bear did next was something none of them could ever have prepared for. This isn't a fantasy. This is survival. And this is the story that left every one of them in tears. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us share more powerful stories like this one with the world. The morning mist was thick, curling low around the mossy ground like a ghost reluctant to leave. The sun barely pierced through the towering spruce trees, casting pale streaks of gold over the Alaskan valley. The silence was broken only by the distant rush of water and the occasional caw of a raven. Mark Jensen, 38, and his two friends, Caleb and Luis, were setting up camp near the base of the valley. It was their fourth day into a wildlife photography expedition, and so far, the most dangerous thing they'd encountered was a moose that wandered too close to their truck. But that morning felt wrong. Mark paused while unpacking his camera, tilting his head. Then it came, a sound none of them had ever heard before. It wasn't human, but it was full of pain, short, desperate gasps, like something, or someone, crying through a crushed windpipe. "Did you hear that?" Caleb asked, already standing. Luis pointed toward the tree line. "It's coming from that ravine. Fast." Without a second thought, they grabbed the small emergency kit and sprinted toward the source of the sound. The forest grew denser, the air colder. Fog clung to their clothes. Every step felt heavier than the last. Not from exhaustion, but dread. And then they saw it. Beneath a twisted tangle of roots, on the muddy edge of a stream, was a baby grizzly cub, no more than a few weeks old, locked in the coils of a massive anaconda. Its fur was slick with mud and blood. Its small body spasmed against the crushing grip. The serpent's head hovered nearby, unblinking, waiting for the final breath. For a second, all three men froze. "This isn't even its habitat," Mark whispered. "What the hell is a snake like this doing here?" "No time," Luis said, reaching for the flare gun in his vest. "We need to scare it off now." Caleb ran wide to distract the snake. Mark rushed forward with a branch, aiming for its head. The anaconda reared up, hissing, tightening its grip. The cub let out another breathless cry, barely audible. The flare gun cracked. A bright burst of red light seared the sky. The snake flinched, loosening slightly. Mark didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, slamming the branch across the anaconda's midsection. Once, twice. Then Luis joined in. The creature hissed louder, then suddenly slithered backward into the brush, disappearing so fast it was as if it had never been there. The cub collapsed. Mark knelt beside it, hands trembling. The little bear was breathing, shallow but steady. One leg was limp. Ribs were bruised. Blood trickled from its ear. It had minutes at most. And then, from the trees behind them, came a rumble that made the ground vibrate. She had arrived. A massive grizzly, The mother stepped from the fog like a force of nature, and her eyes weren't on them. They were locked on her cub. The grizzly stood completely still, a living statue cloaked in steam and shadow. Her massive chest heaved with slow, deliberate breaths. Every muscle, every twitch of fur screamed power. The fog swirled around her legs like she belonged to another world. Not just wilderness, but something ancient and untouchable. Mark's heart was pounding so hard it made his vision pulse. No one moved. Caleb's whisper was barely a breath. "Don't run. Whatever you do, don't run." The mother bear lowered her nose. She didn't growl. She didn't charge. Instead, she took a step. Not toward them, but toward her cub. The men instinctively backed away, giving her space. Mark remained kneeling beside the cub, frozen by something deeper than fear. Awe. He expected rage. A mother finding strange humans around her injured baby? It should have ended in blood. But what came next? None of them were ready for. The bear stopped just short of her cub. Her head tilted, and she let out a sound so soft, so low and trembling, it barely existed. A vocalization that felt like a question. A check-in. A call through pain. The cub twitched. A flicker of life. A whimper in response. The mother closed the final distance and sat beside him. She didn't roar. She didn't bare her teeth. Her massive paw reached forward, and with heartbreaking gentleness, she nudged the cub's head. Once, twice. Then she looked up, straight at Mark. And in those dark eyes, something impossible passed between them. Not words, not thoughts, but understanding. Mark slowly raised both hands, palms up. No threat. "She's asking for help," Luis muttered. Caleb's eyebrows shot up. "What?" "She brought him here. She let us get close. She's not attacking. She knows." Mark glanced down at the cub. "If we don't act now, he won't survive another hour." The bear made no move as Mark gently slid his jacket beneath the cub, lifting him like an injured child. The cub let out a faint whimper, but didn't resist. Blood matted his fur, his breathing ragged. The mother's eyes followed every movement, but still she didn't growl. When Mark rose, the cub cradled against his chest. The bear did something none of them could have predicted. She stepped back. One step, then another, and then she sat, watching, waiting. Mark turned to the others. "We need to move. Carefully. Slowly." With trembling limbs and tight grips on their breath, they walked, step by step, back toward the camp. The mother bear followed. Not close, not aggressively, just present. A silent sentinel in the fog. Back at the tents, the med kit was already open. Luis heated clean water. Caleb found an old blanket. Mark laid the cub down and began cleaning the wounds. Puncture marks from the Anaconda's coils ran across his belly. One leg looked dislocated, but the little one was still fighting. Minutes passed in silence. Then, from just beyond the camp's edge, the mother bear sat, motionless, unblinking, as if she had handed her child over, and was trusting strangers to save what she could not. The makeshift camp glowed dimly under the flickering lantern light, shadows dancing across nylon and trees. But inside the largest tent, time had frozen. Mark sat on a pile of sleeping bags, bent over the little grizzly cub. His fingers moved gently, cleaning wounds, wrapping torn flesh, trying not to flinch at the cub's low moans. Every whimper felt like a knife twisting inside him. Outside, the men moved quietly, whispering only when necessary. None of them dared speak loudly, not with her still watching. The mother bear hadn't left. She stood at the forest's edge, her eyes two golden coins glinting in the dark. Not pacing, not growling, just waiting. Her body trembled with the cold, but she didn't leave her post. Mark kept glancing toward her shadow. "She's not going anywhere," he murmured to himself. "Not until she knows." Luis handed him a thermos of warm water mixed with honey. "Try this," he said. "It's how the Rangers fed orphaned cubs back in Chile. Might work." Mark slowly brought the bottle's spout to the cub's lips. Nothing. Then, the tiniest flicker. A pink tongue reached for the warmth. A drop. Then two. Mark felt the pressure in his chest release just enough for him to breathe. "He's drinking," he whispered. Luis sat down beside him, exhausted. "That's something." For the next hour, they took turns, feeding, watching, wiping sweat from the cub's fur. The hours stretched, slow and fragile. Every breath from the cub was counted. At some point, Caleb returned from checking the perimeter. "We're good," he said softly. "And she's still there." Mark didn't answer. His attention was locked on the tiny rise and fall of the cub's ribs. The faint tremor of breath. Life, barely holding on. "You think he's going to make it?" Caleb asked, voice tight. Mark hesitated. He shouldn't have, not after that. But he glanced toward the forest edge. "She brought him to us. If she had waited even 10 more minutes, he'd be gone." Caleb nodded silently. "That part still gives me chills." Then, a sound broke the quiet. A deep, throaty huff from the woods. Not hostile, not even loud, but it made every man freeze. She had stood up. The mother bear took one slow step forward, her massive paw crunching a twig. Mark stood instinctively, moving between her and the cub. "Hey," he said, not shouting. "Just steady. We're helping." She paused, sniffed the air. Then, slowly, almost too slowly to notice, she sat back down, watching again. Trust, Mark thought. This is what it looks like. Terrifying, fragile, and sacred. He turned back to the cub, who now slept under a blanket of soft wool. His breathing was steadier. Not strong, but not fading either. The storm of the night had passed, for now, but nobody in that tent would sleep. Not while the weight of that trust kept pressing against the edges of the trees. Not while a mother waited in silence for morning. Morning didn't come with a sunrise. It crept in slowly, as if the sky itself didn't dare disturb the fragile peace of the clearing. Mark had spent the night in a haze of watchfulness, checking the cub's breathing, cleaning its wounds, feeding it drops of honey water when it stirred. He couldn't remember when he last closed his eyes, but exhaustion hadn't won. When he finally stepped out of the tent, the cold hit his skin like a slap. Frost glittered on the grass. His breath hung in the air. And there she was, still. The mother grizzly hadn't moved an inch from her place on the ridge. Her fur was covered in dew, her eyes locked on the camp like a sentinel who couldn't blink. Mark didn't know how she had stayed awake so long, or how she endured the cold, but she had. "I don't think she left all night," Louise said, stepping beside him. "She didn't," Mark replied. "I would have heard." The cub stirred again. This time, when Mark checked, there was something different. Resistance. Not much, but enough. When he touched the shoulder wound to apply a fresh bandage, the cub let out a faint growl. Mark smiled. That's more like it. Still, the injury was deep, and there was swelling around the joint. Mark knew enough about animal physiology to recognize the signs. Infection was possible. Worse, a fracture. "We need a vet," he said aloud. Louise frowned. "Nearest one's in Valdez. That's at least 2 hours." "We can't wait," Mark said. "He needs proper care, X-rays, antibiotics. If it's bone, we're out of our league." "And the mother?" Mark's stomach tightened. That was the impossible part. They couldn't explain to a bear what they were doing. They couldn't promise she'd see her cub again. And yet, if they didn't act, he might not survive the next 24 hours. He turned toward the forest edge, toward her. "She brought him to us," Mark said quietly. "She trusted us. I think maybe she knows." Louise looked at him, skeptical. But when Mark slowly walked toward the bear, not close, just halfway, and raised his hands in a slow gesture of peace, the mother didn't growl, didn't move. She watched. He turned back, walked to the tent, and carefully lifted the bundled cub. When he stepped toward the jeep with the cub in his arms, the mother grizzly stood again. Mark's pulse raced. He whispered, "Please, just trust me." The bear held her ground, her muscles tensed, her eyes locked on the bundle. And then, the impossible. She sat. Mark opened the rear door, placed the cub gently in a cushioned crate, and shut it. Louise was already behind the wheel. "Let's move," he said. Mark gave one last glance back. The bear hadn't moved, but her eyes followed the jeep as it pulled away. Slowly, carefully. Each turn of the tires pressed a question into Mark's chest. Would she be there when they came back? Would she understand? The road stretched ahead like a promise. Behind them, the mother bear stood alone, watching as her world, her only cub, disappeared into the trees. The drive to Valdez felt like a lifetime compressed into 2 hours of tension. The jeep rumbled over frost-covered gravel, and inside, the wounded cub whimpered occasionally, his breathing shallow but steady. Mark sat in the back seat, his eyes glued to the small crate on the floor. His hand rested on the bars, fingers twitching every time the cub stirred. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the crunch of tires on ice and the occasional mutter from Louise checking GPS. "She's probably still watching us," Mark murmured. Luis gave him a sideways glance through the rearview mirror. "If she is, she's a damn miracle." Mark didn't answer. His heart was still back at the clearing, with her. That image, the bear sitting down as they drove away, not out of resignation, but of trust. It haunted him. They arrived at the small wildlife center just before noon. Snow flurries danced in the air as they rushed inside, carrying the crate. The vet on duty was a woman in her 60s named Ellen Foster. Short, white-haired, with deep lines on her face and eyes that had seen too much. But the moment she saw what was in the crate, she froze mid-step. "That's a grizzly cub," she said. "Where's the mother?" Mark looked her in the eye. "She brought him to us." Ellen didn't ask more, just pointed. "Get him on the table." The next 30 minutes moved like clockwork. IV fluids, antiseptics, blood work, and then the X-rays. Mark stood just outside the window as the machine hummed, his arms crossed tightly, heart beating like a drum. Ellen emerged with the results in hand. Her expression was complicated. "The good news," she began, "is that he's strong. Dehydrated, anemic, but strong. The wound is infected, but we caught it in time." "And the bad news?" Ellen held up the X-ray. A clear fracture ran along the cub's front shoulder blade. "He needs surgery, a pin to hold the bone while it heals. Without it, he won't use that leg properly again. If he can't walk right, he can't survive in the wild." Luis exhaled sharply. "Then do it." Ellen hesitated. "I've done this with mountain lions and lynx. Never a grizzly. It's high risk. He's small, but still wild." "We don't care about the odds," Mark said. "We care about him." Surgery was scheduled for that afternoon. Mark and Luis sat in the waiting room, their nerves stretched thin. Mark gripped the edge of his chair, knuckles white, his mind spinning with images. The cub's tiny body, the mother bear's eyes, the clearing. Time crawled. After what felt like an eternity, Ellen returned, her gloves off, her face unreadable. "It went well," she finally said. "He's sedated now, recovering. We'll monitor him through the night." Mark leaned forward, face buried in his hands. Relief, quiet and fierce, flooded his chest. That night, they slept in the Jeep. Not because they had to, Ellen offered beds, but because it didn't feel right. They stayed close. The cub wasn't just an animal anymore. He was a story that had chosen them. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the clinic. Mark stood by the recovery pen, watching the cub sleep beneath a warming lamp, its small chest rising and falling steadily. The metal pin in his shoulder was barely visible beneath fresh bandages. He looked peaceful, for the first time in days. Luis handed Mark a cup of coffee. "Doc says he's stable. Another day or two, and he can go." "Go where?" Mark asked, voice low. "He can't be released yet, and we can't exactly keep him." Luis stared at the sleeping cub. "We'll figure it out." They stayed by his side all morning. Every twitch, every murmur, every blink of his eyes brought a wave of cautious hope. At one point, the cub stirred, turned toward Mark's voice, and let out a tiny, rasping growl, weak but instinctual. That sound broke something inside Mark. "You're still fighting," he whispered. "Good." That afternoon, Ellen joined them. "He's responding better than I expected. Eating, too. That's a strong will in there." Mark's eyes didn't leave the cub. He had a reason to survive. She tilted her head. "The mother?" He nodded. "I've never seen anything like it." Ellen sat beside them. "I've worked in wildlife rescue for 35 years. I've seen wolves mourn, moose stand over their calves for hours. But a grizzly trusting a human with her cub, that's not instinct. That's something else." Luis muttered, "That's a miracle." Later that evening, they drove back toward the clearing. The cub was safe, but Mark felt something incomplete, unfinished. The bear had left her cub behind, but was she still waiting? As the jeep turned off the main road and wound through the woods, the air turned sharper, filled with silence and snow. By the time they reached the clearing, night had fallen. Moonlight spilled onto the frozen ground, painting the scene in ghostly blue. She was there, sitting exactly where they'd left her, at the edge of the woods, massive and silent, like a statue carved from the forest itself. Mark stepped out slowly. The crunch of snow under his boots echoed too loudly. The bear didn't move. "I don't know if you understand me," Mark said softly. "But he's alive. He's going to make it." The bear's ears twitched. Mark continued, voice cracking. "You did the impossible. You asked for help. You trusted me. And I swear to you, I won't let him down." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the bear rose. She didn't growl, didn't approach. She just stood tall, eyes locked with his, and slowly, ever so slowly, turned and walked back into the forest. Not retreating, not afraid, just done. "She knows," Luis whispered behind him. "She knows he's safe." Mark nodded, swallowing hard. His chest ached, not from cold, but from the weight of that moment. A farewell without sound, a pact between two worlds. They left the clearing in silence. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He sat outside the clinic under the stars, thinking of everything that had happened: the river, the anaconda, the screams, the impossible trust of a mother bear. And somehow, despite the chaos, he felt peace. Because sometimes, in the harshest corners of nature, kindness blooms where no one expects it. The rain had stopped, but the forest remained soaked in a heavy, damp stillness. The underbrush, once a battleground, now lay silent beneath scattered feathers, broken twigs, and the faint trail of blood slowly fading into the soil. The anaconda was gone, chased into the shadows by a fury she hadn't expected. And in its place, something profound remained. Liam stood outside the ranger station, his jacket drenched, cradling a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. A single orange kitten, the bold one from earlier, curled up on the windowsill beside him. It blinked slowly, its small body rising and falling in a steady rhythm, a soft purr barely audible beneath the hush of morning. Inside, The baby bear slept on a thick blanket, the wound on his side cleaned, stitched, and dressed by a vet rushed in overnight. He breathed deeply, occasionally twitching. A dream, perhaps, or just the relief of being warm again. Across the room, the bear's mother sat like a carved statue, immobile but ever alert. Her fur glistened under the fluorescent lights, damp but beautiful. Her eyes didn't waver. Every movement anyone made passed through her like a filtered calculation of risk. But there was no aggression left in her, only a fierce, tired watchfulness. After the fight, after the chaos, she'd done something none of them could explain. She didn't run. She didn't retaliate. Instead, she sat by her cub's side, watching, waiting, guarding. And when the baby had been taken inside, she followed, step by cautious step, until she was in the station, breathing the scent of humans, machines, antiseptic, and trust. The ranger team had prepared a transport cage. Liam had begged them to wait. "She brought him here," he said. "Let her stay." And so they had. Against every protocol, every instinct to protect themselves, they had let her remain. And somehow, the forest queen, the mother grizzly who could rip a man apart, had respected the fragile rules of their sanctuary. Liam moved quietly into the room and crouched beside the cub. The mother didn't move, didn't growl, only followed him with her eyes. He whispered, "He's strong. He's going to be okay." She blinked once, slowly. Later that day, after the vet confirmed the cub would survive, a plan was made. They would transport both mother and cub back to the deep forest, to a location safe and remote, where nature could reclaim what had nearly been lost. Before they left, the team stood in a circle outside the station. Silence fell among them as the two bears were loaded into separate compartments of the same trailer. And then, just before the door was shut, the mother bear looked over her shoulder. Her eyes locked onto Liam's one last time. There was no growl, no motion, only a look, raw, ancient, grateful. No one spoke for a long time after they left. Later that night, when the storm rolled back in, Liam sat at his desk, the little orange kitten curled on his lap. The only sound was the rain and the soft rhythm of a cat purring. In his heart, something had changed. Not everything wild is meant to stay apart from us. Sometimes, in the darkest moments, something beautiful chooses to trust. If this story moved you, imagine what else nature is trying to tell us. Share this with someone who needs to believe in something greater, in trust, in connection, in second chances. Comment, "Trust," if this made you cry. Follow for more real-life stories that touch the soul. An orphaned grizzly cub, a loyal farm dog, and a bond no one ever expected. Raised side by side, they became brothers in a world that didn't understand them. Years later, after life had torn them apart, the bear returned. But he wasn't alone. What he brought changed everything. If you believe that love and loyalty can survive even the fiercest storms, this story will break your heart in the most beautiful way. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us share more powerful stories like this one. The rain had been falling for days, turning the dirt roads of northern Idaho into rivers of mud. It was the kind of storm that kept even the deer hidden and sent ranchers muttering curses under their breath. Ben Carter, 34, leaned on the wooden porch rail of his small cattle farm, watching the gray sky bleed into the hills. At his feet, his faithful border collie, Max, whined softly. Max never liked storms. Maybe because he'd been born under one just like this, a shivering pup found clinging to life in a broken barn. That was 3 years ago. Now Max was Ben's only real companion. Out here, there wasn't much room for other people. Just miles of fence lines, stubborn cattle, and memories Ben tried hard to outrun. It was Max who heard it first, a thin, desperate cry threading through the sound of the storm. He bolted from the porch, barking sharply. Ben cursed and grabbed his coat, following him across the muddy yard toward the tree line. There, tangled in the thorny underbrush, was a sight that made Ben's heart seize. A tiny grizzly cub, soaked to the bone, eyes wide with terror. His small frame shivered so violently that the branches rattled around him. No mother in sight, no tracks leading away. Ben didn't hesitate. He scooped the cub up carefully, ignoring the sharp thorns that tore at his hands. The cub was light, too light, just a sack of fur and trembling bones. Max sniffed at the cub anxiously, whining again, tail tucked between his legs. Back at the house, Ben wrapped the cub in an old quilt and stoked the fire until the cabin glowed with warmth. The cub barely moved. Only his eyes followed Ben's every step. He should call fish and game, Ben thought grimly. He knew that. But something inside him, something raw and broken, couldn't let go of this little creature just yet. Maybe it was because he saw too much of himself in that cub. Lost. Alone. Caught in a world that didn't know what to do with him. Max seemed to understand. He curled up next to the bundle of fur, pressing his warm body against the cub's side. The little bear let out a tiny, rasping sigh and closed his eyes. Ben sat down heavily in his old armchair, staring into the fire. "You're gonna be a handful," he muttered. "Guess we'll figure it out together." He didn't know then what he was starting. He didn't know that this little cub, who he'd name Boone, would grow up alongside Max, thinking he was just another dog. And he couldn't possibly imagine the day, years later, when Boone would come back, bringing a gift that would tear open every scar Ben thought had healed. But for now, there was only the rain, the fire, and the fragile beginnings of a family stitched together by nothing more than need, and a little bit of hope. The days after the storm settled into a strange kind of rhythm. Boone, the little grizzly cub, adapted to life on Ben's farm with a clumsy eagerness that left both man and dog constantly surprised. At first, Boone could barely stand without swaying. Max treated him like an awkward puppy, nudging him upright when he toppled over, growling playfully when the bear swatted too hard with his oversized paws. Boone learned quickly. Within a week, he followed Max everywhere, limping after him across muddy pastures, poking his nose into the feed bins, collapsing in the hayloft when his tiny legs gave out. Ben watched it all with a tightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He set up a makeshift bed for Boone in the corner of the barn, near Max's sleeping spot. At night, Boone would curl against Max's warm body, tiny snores filling the silent barn like a lullaby. Sometimes, when Ben couldn't sleep, he'd sit in the barn doorway, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching them breathe in sync under the moonlight. The rules said Boone didn't belong here. The world would call him dangerous, unpredictable, a liability. But when Ben looked into those dark, earnest eyes, so full of trust it almost hurt to meet them, he didn't see a future threat. He saw family. Of course, Boone wasn't a normal puppy. By the end of the second month, he was double Max's size. He still tumbled after sticks Max chased, still wrestled in the dirt until they were both a mess of fur and mud. But Boone's strength was becoming undeniable. A single joyful swipe could send Max rolling across the yard. Ben knew he couldn't hide Boone forever. Already, neighbors were beginning to notice the strange dog at the edge of the woods. He needed a plan. One chilly morning, Ben hitched up his truck and drove Boone and Max out into the dense foothills behind his land. Miles of unclaimed territory thick with rivers and old-growth forest. "If you're gonna survive, you gotta learn to be what you are," Ben told Boone, crouching beside him. The bear blinked up at him, cocking his head the way Max did when he didn't understand. Ben's throat tightened. He pointed toward the woods. "That's your home someday. Not this farm. Not me." Max whined, pawing at Boone's side. Ben stayed out there for hours, throwing fish into the stream for Boone to catch, letting him explore under careful watch. Boone was clumsy, but instinct stirred beneath his playful swipes. Maybe there was hope. Maybe, given time, Boone could survive out there on his own. Still, when they loaded back into the truck that night, Boone pressed his massive head against Ben's shoulder, letting out a low, contented rumble. And Ben realized, with a sharp twist of pain, that Boone didn't want to be wild. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He wanted to be with them. With Max. With Ben. In the only pack he had ever known. As winter crept closer, and Boone grew heavier, Ben knew the clock was ticking. He had built a life on isolation, on not needing anyone. Now there were two beating hearts that needed him, and he needed them too, whether he admitted it or not. But how long could this fragile, stolen happiness last? And what would it cost when the world inevitably came knocking? By the time Boone reached his first winter on the farm, he was no longer a tiny, clumsy cub. He was a yearling, strong and thick-furred, standing nearly shoulder-high to Ben when he reared up on his hind legs. And although in Boone's mind he was still just one of the dogs, the outside world had started to notice. It began innocently enough. Ben had taken Max into town for supplies, leaving Boone behind in the barn as usual. But when a passing hunter saw the giant dog lumbering near the fence line, word spread fast. First, it was a whisper at the gas station, then a rumor over coffee at the diner. "You hear about Carter's place? Swear to God he's got a bear living with his collie. Guy's always been a little touched, but a bear? That's suicide." Ben felt the walls closing in. He made excuses to stay home, stopped taking Max into town, started keeping Boone locked inside whenever strangers came too close. But Boone wasn't a secret you could hide forever. One afternoon, Ben found a notice nailed to his fence. State wildlife officials to inspect premises. 10 days notice. Ben tore it down with shaking hands. Inside the house, Boone and Max wrestled on the worn living room rug, oblivious. Boone let out a happy rumble when he saw Ben, trotting over and nudging him with his massive head like a child asking for attention. Ben sank to the floor, burying his face in Boone's thick fur. His throat burned. He had known, deep down, this day would come. You couldn't keep a grizzly as a pet. You couldn't freeze time. Still, knowing didn't make it hurt less. Boone wasn't a project. He wasn't a problem to fix. He was family. He was Ben's second chance, the one good thing life had given him after taking so much. That night, sitting by the fire, Ben made a decision. He would teach Boone to live free. Not just visits to the woods, not just fishing trips, real survival, real independence. It had to be that way. Boone deserved to live wild, to be what he was born to be, even if it broke Ben's heart into pieces. The next morning, Ben packed the old truck with camping gear, enough supplies for 2 weeks. Max leapt excitedly into the front seat, Boone squeezing into the truck bed with a confused grunt. "We're going on an adventure, buddy," Ben said, forcing a smile. "Time to show you the real world." As the sun rose behind them, casting golden light over the hills, Ben drove toward the deep heart of the forest, to places so wild that even maps gave up trying to name them. He didn't know if Boone would understand. He didn't know if he was strong enough to let go. But he had 10 days to teach the bear he loved more than life itself how to survive without him. And somewhere deep inside, he knew. This wasn't just Boone's test. It was his, too. The first few days in the wilderness were harder than Ben expected, and far harder than Boone could understand. Ben had chosen a stretch of protected land far from any town, where rivers braided through towering pines and ancient cliffs carved the sky. A place big enough to lose a bear, if that bear was ready to be lost. They set up camp by a cold, clear stream. Boone and Max explored together, with Boone bounding ahead like an oversized puppy, snapping at snowflakes and clumsily chasing after rabbits he never caught. But survival wasn't a game. Ben had a plan. He would teach Boone to fish, forage, and fend for himself. The first fishing lesson was a disaster. Boone splashed into the stream with excitement, scattering the fish before he even realized what he was supposed to do. Max barked at him from the bank, as if scolding a reckless little brother. Ben laughed despite himself. "Patience, Boone," he said softly. "The good things are worth waiting for." On the third day, Boone managed to snag a trout between his teeth, looking bewildered but proud when he dropped it at Max's feet. Ben knelt beside him, ruffling the thick fur between his ears. "That's it, buddy. You're getting it." But every small victory stabbed at Ben's heart. Each moment Boone grew more independent was a reminder of what had to come. The moment when he would have to stay out here, and Ben would drive away without him. At night, Boone curled close to the fire, with Max tucked against his side. Sometimes, Boone would lift his head and stare at the dark woods beyond their camp, as if sensing something pulling at him. Ben watched him from the shadows, feeling the tightening in his chest with every passing hour. It wasn't just Boone changing. Ben could feel it inside himself, too. A crack widening into a chasm he didn't know how to cross. He wasn't ready. He had spent so long learning how to be alone again. Letting someone, even a bear, into his broken heart had been a risk he hadn't meant to take. And now, the thought of losing Boone felt almost unbearable. On the 6th night, as snow began to fall in slow, heavy flakes, Boone didn't settle by the fire. Instead, he paced the edge of the woods, sniffing the cold air, grumbling low in his chest. Ben sat very still, not calling him back, not making a sound. He knew what it meant. Boone was starting to feel it, the call of the wild that no human love could silence. When Boone finally returned to camp, he didn't climb into Ben's lap like he used to as a cub. He laid down a few feet away, watching the dark with restless, gleaming eyes. Ben stared into the fire, feeling the burn of unshed tears. "You're getting ready," he whispered. "You're gonna be okay." The words tasted like ash. He had 9 more days before the officials came looking. 9 days to teach Boone. 9 days to find a way to say goodbye. And somehow, Ben realized, 9 days to find a way to survive losing him without losing himself again. The sun rose pale and cold on the 8th day. Ben sat by the dead embers of the fire, sipping bitter coffee, watching Boone patrol the edge of the woods like a restless spirit. Max lay at Ben's feet, head on his paws, eyes tracking Boone's every move. There was a weight in the air that morning, a tension neither man nor dog could shake off. Ben stood slowly, brushing the frost from his jacket. "Come on, boys," he called. "Time to find breakfast." Boone lifted his massive head, huffed, and loped toward the trees with an eagerness that almost looked impatient. Max barked once, then took off after him. Ben followed, boots crunching over frozen leaves, heart uneasy. They spent the morning along the river, where the fish ran thick and silver. Boone waded in deep, his strength and instincts now sharp and sure. He hauled out 2 trout in less than an hour, tossing one toward Max as if sharing spoils with his brother. Ben laughed, pride swelling in his chest. "You're a natural," he called. But Boone didn't look back. Instead, after a quick shake of his thick fur, he bounded up the opposite bank and disappeared into the tree line, moving faster than Ben had ever seen. "Boone!" Ben shouted. No response. Max barked frantically, circling where Boone had vanished. Ben dropped the fish and sprinted after him, heart slamming against his ribs. Branches tore at his face, mud sucked at his boots. He ran until his lungs burned, calling Boone's name over and over. Silence answered him. He searched until nightfall. Max howled under the moon, a long, mournful sound that twisted Ben's gut into knots. But Boone was gone. Ben slumped against a fallen tree, staring blindly into the dark woods. Maybe Boone had finally felt the pull of the wild too strongly to resist. Maybe he had found his true place, as Ben had always hoped. But the way Boone had disappeared, without a glance, without a goodbye, left Ben hollowed out inside, as if someone had scooped the heart clean from his chest. The next morning, Ben packed up camp with numb hands. Max sat by the truck, tail drooping, eyes fixed on the trees. Ben knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's head. "He's where he's supposed to be," Ben said, voice cracking. "We did good, boy. We did what we had to do." Max whined low in his throat, but didn't move. Neither did Ben. Not for a long time. He waited there at the edge of the forest, long after the sun rose and the frost melted, waiting for a sign, waiting for a miracle he didn't believe in. None came. Finally, with a heaviness that seemed to anchor his bones, Ben climbed into the truck, Max hopping in beside him. The road home blurred in Ben's vision. The farm was just as they had left it. Fences sagging, fields silent, the porch light flickering weakly against the early winter dark. Ben unloaded the truck in silence. Max refused to leave the front step, staring down the long driveway as if expecting Boone to come barreling out of the night. But days passed. Then a week. Then 2. No sign of Boone. Ben tried to tell himself he should be happy. Boone had made it. Boone had found the life he was meant for. But every evening, as the sun bled out over the empty fields, Ben felt the ache settle deeper into his bones. A familiar kind of ache. The kind that came from losing someone you loved without getting the chance to say goodbye. He had set Boone free. And in doing so, he had broken his own heart all over again. It was the first heavy snow of the season. Ben was chopping wood behind the barn, breath misting in the freezing air, when Max suddenly bolted from the porch, barking like he hadn't in weeks. Ben dropped the axe immediately. His heart kicked painfully against his ribs. Max raced toward the far end of the property, toward the woods. Ben followed, boots slipping in the new snow, vision blurring from the cold and the sudden, desperate surge of hope. At the edge of the clearing, Max stopped, tail wagging furiously. And standing there, just beyond the fence line, framed by falling snow, was Boone. Bigger, wilder, his fur thick and shaggy, his shoulders broader than Ben had ever imagined. He looked every inch the wild grizzly now, strong, untamed, magnificent. But his eyes, those deep, dark eyes, they were the same. They were Boone's. Ben took a shaky step forward. Boone? The great bear huffed, dipping his head low in a gesture so familiar it made Ben's throat tighten painfully. Boone rumbled softly, a sound halfway between a purr and a growl, and then, incredibly, he nudged something forward with his massive paw. Ben squinted. Something small, shivering against the snow. 2 tiny cubs. 2. Ben staggered closer, disbelief making his steps clumsy. Boone stayed still, watching him with a calm, steady gaze. The cubs, smaller than Boone had been when Ben first found him, whimpered softly. Their fur was matted with snow, their bellies hollow with hunger. Max whined, inching forward carefully. Boone grunted low and gave a slight nod, a permission, as if saying, "They're yours now." Ben dropped to his knees in the snow, arms open, heart hammering. The little cubs hesitated, then toddled toward him, collapsing against his chest, seeking warmth. Tears burned Ben's eyes. He looked up at Boone, choking on emotion. "You brought them here," Ben whispered. "You trusted me." Boone rumbled again, softer this time, almost tender. Ben understood. Boone had found his own life out there in the wild. He had become what Ben always hoped he would become. But when he needed someone he could trust with what mattered most, his own family, he came home. Ben buried his face in the cub's fur, letting the tears fall freely now, hot against his frozen cheeks. When he looked up again, Boone was backing away, slowly, toward the trees. Max barked once, a sharp, almost pleading sound. Boone paused, gave one last long look at the man and dog who had raised him, then turned and disappeared into the snow-shrouded woods without a sound. This time, Ben didn't call him back. He watched Boone's massive form fade into the white, feeling something in his chest crack open, but not from pain, from awe, from pride, from love so deep it hurt. He cradled the two trembling cubs tighter against him, whispering promises he wasn't sure how he'd keep yet. But he would. He had to. Because Boone had trusted him with something far more precious than himself. He had trusted him with his legacy. Winter that year was brutal. The snows piled high against the barn doors. The wind howled through the trees like a chorus of ghosts. But inside the old farmhouse, there was life. Messy, loud, and full of hope. The two cubs, who Ben had named Willow and Ash, grew stronger by the day. Willow, the smaller of the two, was fearless, always climbing onto tables, knocking over feed buckets, tumbling headfirst into snowdrifts with a wild gleam in her eyes. Ash was quieter, more thoughtful, never far from Max's side, watching and learning. Ben built a bigger shelter beside the barn, reinforced with timber and lined with straw, a space big enough for the cubs to grow into, at least for now. The ranch wasn't just a place for cattle anymore. It was a sanctuary. Every morning, Ben rose before the sun, fixing bottles for the cubs, checking fences, teaching Willow and Ash to forage in the frozen woods. Max helped in his way, too, herding the cubs back when they wandered too far, barking when they tried to sneak into the feed room. It was chaos. It was exhausting. It was life, raw and wild and beautiful. And every night, as Ben sat on the porch, Max asleep at his feet and the cubs snoring softly in the shelter, he would look out toward the distant tree line, always wondering, always hoping. Sometimes, just before dawn, he swore he saw a shadow move between the pines, massive and silent and watching. He never called out. He didn't need to. He knew it was Boone, checking on them, protecting them, still part of their family, even from afar. The notice from Wildlife Services eventually came and went. Ben had prepared for a fight, ready to lie, to hide, to do whatever it took to protect Willow and Ash. But the inspection was brief. Maybe the heavy snows helped. Maybe the world just turned a blind eye to a stubborn man and his unusual family. Either way, the cubs stayed. As spring thawed the fields and rivers sang with meltwater, Ben found himself changing too. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, loving. He thought often of Boone, out there carving a life in the mountains, strong, wild, free. And he understood now that real love wasn't about holding on. It was about trusting someone enough to let them go, and still believing they'd find their way back when it mattered most. One evening, as the sunset poured molten gold across the fields, Willow clambered up onto the porch and dropped a clump of wild flowers at Ben's feet, her tongue lolling in a proud, goofy grin. Ben laughed, a real laugh, rich and full, and scooped her up, burying his face in her soft fur. "You're gonna drive me crazy," he said, voice thick with affection. But you're exactly where you're meant to be. And so was he. The scars on his heart hadn't disappeared. But they had new stories now. Stories of second chances, of impossible bonds, of the wild, stubborn, magnificent love that had found him when he needed it most. All because, once upon a time, a lonely man had taken a chance on a lost little bear. And that little bear had never forgotten. If this story touched your heart, remember, sometimes the bonds we build are stronger than anything nature or time can tear apart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with someone who believes in second chances, just like Boone did. Together, let's spread more stories of hope, love, and the wild connections that change our lives forever.